She had never looked like that with him. That was the thought that hit Weston first. Not rage. Not strategy. Just that one quiet, devastating fact landing somewhere behind his ribs like a key turning in a lock he didn't know existed. Camille was glowing. Not the polite, careful smile she wore at his boardroom dinners when she was playing the role she'd signed up for. Not the composed, measured expression she carried through his penthouse hallways like she was afraid to touch anything. This was something else entirely. Her head was thrown back, her whole body moving like the music had personally shown up just for her, laughing at something his half-brother Theo had just said, one hand resting lightly on Theo's shoulder like it had always belonged there. The ballroom was full of New York's most powerful people. Chandeliers dripping light. Women in gowns that cost more than most people's rent. Men who controlled cities shaking hands over glasses of aged bourbon. And in the middle of all of it, Camille Monroe was the most magnetic person in the room, and she was not standing anywhere near her husband. She had no idea who Theo was to him. That part was almost funny. Almost. Weston Cole stood at the far edge of the room with a glass of whiskey he had forgotten to drink, watching his contract wife be exactly the kind of woman he had always suspected she was underneath all that careful composure. Warm. Radiant. Effortless. Real. And he was watching it happen for a man who was not him. The worst part, the truly humiliating part, was that exactly 4 hours ago in the back of his car on the way to this gala, he had looked her straight in the eye and said the words he always said. Because the words were the boundary. The words were the wall. The words kept everything clean and uncomplicated and safe. Remember what this is, Camille. A business arrangement. 2 years. Nothing more. Keep it professional tonight. She had nodded. Not even looked hurt. Just nodded, smoothed her dress, and looked out the window. And now she was out there, laughing like a woman who had never heard the word contract in her entire life. His jaw was so tight his back teeth hurt. And somewhere across that glittering room, his half-brother Theo, the one person on this earth who knew exactly how to find every crack in Weston's armor, spun Camille once on the dance floor, caught her perfectly, and grinned like he'd just won something. Weston set down his glass. Welcome to DOM Romance Besties. If you are already hooked right now, wait until you see what happens next. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button because this story is about to go places nobody saw coming. Welcome, besties. Please like, share, and subscribe, and let me know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. It had started 3 months ago in a conference room on the 42nd floor of Cole Industries. Weston had been sitting at the head of a long glass table, his lawyers arranged on one side, Camille Monroe on the other, with exactly 1 cup of untouched coffee between them and a contract that was 47 pages long. The deal was simple, at least on paper. Weston Cole needed a wife. Not a real one. He needed a woman who could stand beside him at events, smile at the right people, say the right things, and make the board of directors at Cole Industries stop asking uncomfortable questions about his personal life. His grandfather had built the company on the back of a very specific image. Family. Stability. Legacy. And Weston, at 34, unmarried, coldly professional, and completely uninterested in anything resembling a personal life, had been slowly becoming a liability. The other side of the deal was equally practical. Camille Monroe was 28 years old, a freelance event coordinator with a talent that outran her connections, a younger brother in his 2nd year of college, a mother with mounting medical bills, and a bank account that had been losing the argument for the last 6 months. She was not desperate. She was strategic. There was a difference, and she knew it. They had been introduced through a mutual attorney who handled unusual arrangements with unusual discretion. Weston had reviewed her file the same way he reviewed acquisition reports. Methodically. Without sentiment. She was educated, presentable, emotionally intelligent based on reference interviews, and she had signed an NDA before she even knew his name. When she walked into that conference room, he had expected someone nervous. Someone eager. Someone performing. What he got was a woman who sat down across from him, looked directly at him without flinching, read through the entire contract herself before any lawyer summarized it, asked 3 extremely specific questions about exit clauses, and then picked up the pen. He had not expected to notice that her hands were steady. He had noticed anyway. The terms were clear. 2 years. Public appearances, galas, dinners, family events. Separate bedrooms. No emotional entanglement. Monthly compensation deposited directly into her account. At the end of the 2 years, a quiet, mutually agreed upon separation, a generous settlement, and they each walked away clean. Weston had structured the agreement with the same precision he brought to every deal. No ambiguity. No gray areas. No room for things to get complicated. What he had not accounted for was Camille Monroe being the kind of woman who reorganized his entire kitchen on her 3rd day in the penthouse because the layout made no logical sense, argued with his head chef about the nutritional value of his lunch menu, and then had the audacity to be completely right about both. He had not accounted for the way she hummed to herself when she thought no one was listening. He had not accounted for a lot of things. But he had rules. And the rules existed for a reason. And he was Weston Cole, and Weston Cole did not lose control of situations. The gala was the quarterly Cole Industries charity event, the kind of evening that required both of them to show up, look good, and be seen together long enough to satisfy the board members who were also in attendance. Camille had handled the entire preparation with her usual brisk competence, selected her own dress, coordinated their arrival time, briefed herself on every major guest so she could hold a conversation with anyone in the room. She had not, however, been briefed on Theo. Because Weston had not mentioned Theo. Theo Mercer was 31 years old, Weston's half-brother on his father's side, the product of an affair that had fractured the Cole family when Weston was 14 and Theo was 11, and neither of them had asked for any of it. They shared a father, a last name that Theo didn't use, and absolutely nothing else. Theo had grown up outside the Cole empire, built his own career in architecture, moved through the world with a lightness that Weston had never possessed and had long ago stopped trying to understand. They were not enemies. They were not friends. They were 2 men connected by blood and separated by everything else, who showed up in the same rooms occasionally because New York was smaller than it looked. Weston had known Theo would be at the gala. He had simply not mentioned it to Camille. It had not seemed relevant. It was currently feeling extremely relevant. Theo had found Camille within 20 minutes of their arrival, which meant he had either been watching for her or he had the kind of instinct for interesting people that had always made him insufferable. He had introduced himself as simply Theo, offered her his hand with an easy smile, and said something that made her laugh. A real laugh. The kind that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Weston had been across the room talking to a senator. By the time he extracted himself from that conversation, they were on the dance floor. He told himself he was watching because Theo was not to be trusted in general. He told himself it was surveillance, professional concern, contractual awareness. He did not tell himself it was the way her dress moved when she turned, or the way she tilted her head when she was genuinely amused, or the fact that he had lived in the same penthouse as this woman for 3 months, and she had never once looked that unguarded around him. He picked up his glass again. He put it down without drinking. Across the room, Theo said something else, and Camille pressed her hand briefly over her mouth to contain her laughter, and Weston felt a sensation move through his chest that he absolutely refused to name. He was already moving before he decided to move. He crossed the ballroom at a pace that was not quite fast enough to draw attention, but was definitely not casual. 2 of his board members tried to catch his eye. He did not catch theirs back. A photographer moved to intercept him for a shot. He redirected smoothly without breaking stride. He reached the edge of the dance floor just as the song was ending. Theo looked up and saw him coming, and for exactly 1 second, something moved behind his eyes. Not guilt. Not surprise. Something more calculated than both. "Weston," he said, extending his hand. "You look like a man who's been watching the clock." Weston shook his hand with the practiced warmth of someone who had learned to disguise everything. "Good to see you," he said, and it sounded almost true. He turned to Camille. The photographers are looking for us. We should do the rounds. Camille looked at him, then at Theo, then back at him. Something in her expression shifted, barely, just a flicker of assessment. She was perceptive. He had always known that. Of course, she said, and her voice was completely smooth. She smiled at Theo. It was lovely meeting you. Theo smiled back, and it was the kind of smile that said this conversation is not finished. The pleasure was entirely mine, Camille. Weston placed his hand at the small of her back as they turned away from the dance floor. It was a practice gesture. They had done it 100 times at events. It meant nothing. He pressed slightly firmer than usual. He was aware of that. He was choosing not to examine it. If you think Weston is acting like a man who has zero feelings, I need you to scroll down right now and comment the word contract because we are only getting started and this man has no idea what is happening to him. They moved through the rest of the gala with the easy coordination they had developed over 3 months. Camille was exceptional at this part. She remembered names, connected people, said exactly the right things, laughed at exactly the right moments, and looked at Weston with precisely the right amount of warmth to convince an entire room that they were exactly what the contract said they were presenting as. He had always been good at reading people. He could tell when someone was performing. He could not always tell, with Camille, where the performance ended. The car ride home was quiet. New York slid past the tinted windows, all light and motion and noise contained safely on the other side of the glass. Camille sat beside him with her wrap pulled around her shoulders, looking out at the city, and he sat on his side of the seat doing exactly what he always did, which was not looking at her. "How do you know Theo?" she asked. He had been waiting for it. "We share a father," he said. "We're not close." She was quiet for a moment. "He's very charming. Most people find him that way." Another pause. She turned her head slightly, not quite toward him. "You seem annoyed." "I'm not annoyed." She made a small sound that was not quite agreement. "Okay," she said, and turned back to the window. He wanted to say something else. He could not identify what it was. So he said nothing, and the car moved through the city, and the space between them on the back seat was exactly the same distance it had always been, and somehow it felt longer tonight. The following morning, Weston was in his home office by 6, which was normal. What was not normal was that he was not looking at the documents in front of him. He was looking at the door. He could hear Camille in the kitchen. She woke up early every morning and made herself coffee with a specific amount of care that he had never been able to explain. Like the process itself mattered to her. The sound of the grinder, then the press, then a few minutes of silence, then the particular quiet of someone sitting with their own thoughts before the day officially started. He had learned her mornings without meaning to. He turned back to his documents. 20 minutes later, she appeared in the doorway of his office with a second cup of coffee, which she placed on the edge of his desk without a word. She did this sometimes. Not every day. Enough that he had stopped being surprised by it. He looked at the cup. Then at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. She shrugged, already turning to leave. "I made too much." He looked at the cup for a long time after she left. Then he drank it. It was, as always, exactly how he took it. He had not told her how he took his coffee. She had simply paid attention. That was, he was beginning to understand, the most dangerous thing about Camille Monroe. She paid attention to everything, quietly, without making a performance of it, and then she just knew things. Things he had not offered. Things he had not realized she was collecting. He needed to be more careful. He was not sure more careful was still available to him. 3 days later, the thing that was not supposed to happen happened. Theo called Camille directly. Weston found out because Camille told him, which was either the sign of a woman with nothing to hide or a woman who understood exactly what transparency could accomplish in a situation like this. He genuinely could not tell which. She came to find him in his office that evening, leaned in the doorway with her phone in her hand, and said, "Your brother called me today. He'd like to take me to lunch." Weston put down his pen very carefully. "How did he get your number?" She tilted her head. "He said you both share a family attorney. I'm guessing that's how." He looked at her. "And what did you say?" "I told him I'd let him know." She paused. "I'm telling you first." He held her gaze for a moment. The honest answer was no. The honest answer was absolutely not even close. Stay away from Theo. The honest answer lived somewhere in his chest behind 3 months of carefully maintained distance and a contract that said feelings were not part of this arrangement. What he said was, "You don't need my permission for your social calendar." She studied him. "That's not what I asked." He looked back at his desk. "Do what you want, Camille." He heard her leave. He heard the soft sound of her door closing down the hall a few minutes later. He sat at his desk for a long time doing nothing. He did not sleep well that night. He told himself it was work stress. He had several active acquisitions, a difficult negotiation with a European partner, a board meeting in 2 days that required preparation. There were many legitimate reasons to be awake at 2 in the morning staring at the ceiling. Theo was not one of them. He picked up his phone. He almost called Theo. He put the phone down. He picked it up again and opened his messages, scrolled to his conversation with Theo, which was sparse, professional, and old. Their last exchange had been 9 months ago about a distant relative's funeral. He put the phone face down on the nightstand. He did not call Theo. What he did, and he was aware this was not rational, was get up at 2:30 in the morning and go to his home gym and work out for an hour and a half until his body was too tired for his brain to run the same calculations on a loop. When he came back down the hall, he passed Camille's door. There was a thin strip of light under it. She was awake too. He stood outside her door for 4 seconds. He kept walking. The lunch with Theo happened 2 days later. Camille wore a rust-colored dress and left at noon and came back at 2:30 with a takeout box she said was leftover dessert, which she left on the kitchen counter with a sticky note that said help yourself because his chef's day off was Thursday and she knew he forgot to eat on those days. He ate it at his desk at 4 in the afternoon and said nothing about it. She did not bring up the lunch. He did not ask about it. By the end of that week, he knew something was shifting. He couldn't stop it the way he couldn't stop a current once it had your feet. He just kept making the same choice over and over, which was to say nothing, feel nothing, be exactly who the contract required him to be. And then the board meeting happened. The meeting had been circled on his calendar for 6 weeks. It was the semi-annual performance review. And this particular one carried weight because his grandfather's estate attorney would be present along with 4 senior board members who had been quietly concerned about the state of Weston's personal life since his last relationship, which had ended badly 3 years ago and had briefly become tabloid fodder. Camille had been prepared. They had gone over talking points the night before. She knew which board members to focus warmth on, which ones were formal, which ones responded to wit, which ones cared most about the family legacy angle. She had been prepared. What she had not been prepared for was Gerald Whitmore, senior board member, 81 years old, sharp as glass, leaning forward during a break in proceedings and saying directly to Camille, "Young lady, tell me something true about your husband. Not what's in the press release. Something real." The room went quiet in that particular way it does when someone has asked the question nobody else dared ask. Weston had gone very still. Camille had looked at Gerald for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "He drinks his coffee black, but only before 9 in the morning. After that he pretends he doesn't want it and then forgets to eat entirely if someone doesn't leave something on his desk. He works until he's solved whatever is bothering him, which means sometimes he works until 3 a.m., and the next day he's in a terrible mood, but won't say why. He argues with figures more than with people. And he notices everything, even when he's pretending not to." She paused. She glanced at Weston, quick and careful. "And he is the most disciplined person I have ever met, which means when he does care about something, he cares about it completely. He just doesn't talk about it." The room was very quiet. Gerald Whitmore nodded slowly. "That," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said in this room in 20 years. Weston did not look at Camille for the rest of the meeting. In the car afterward, she stared out the window again, and he sat on his side of the seat, and the city moved past them, and he said, after a long time, "You didn't have to say all of that." She kept looking out the window. "You needed them to believe us." He looked at her profile. "That's not why you said it." She didn't answer for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "I said what was true." He turned back to face forward. His hands rested on his knees. The car was very quiet. He said, "You're right about the coffee." She made that small sound again, the one that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite a smile, and it settled somewhere in his chest like it was planning to stay. Okay, besties, if you're not on the edge of your seat right now, I don't know what to tell you. Smash that like button and tell me in the comments, are you Team Weston or are you Team Theo right now? Because it is about to get so much more complicated. The morning after the dock, Weston came down to the kitchen and found Camille already there, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the way she looked up when she heard him, quick and unguarded, like she had been waiting, and then looked back down at her coffee like she hadn't been. He poured his cup. He sat across from her. The morning light was doing what morning light does when you are suddenly hyper-aware of it. She said, without looking up, "I've been thinking about what you said." He said, and she looked at him. She said, "I think you're right. I think it stopped being just a contract a while ago for me too." He held her gaze. She said, "I'm not saying that to complicate things. I'm saying it because you were honest and it seemed unfair to leave it one-sided." He said, "When?" She tilted her head. He said, "When did it stop being just a contract for you?" She considered it. She said, "The night you came home late and you thought I was asleep but I wasn't, and you stood outside my door for 4 seconds and then kept walking. I know it was 4 seconds because I counted." He was very still. She said, "That was about 6 weeks in." She looked at her coffee. "I thought, that's not a man who feels nothing. That's a man who feels something and is terrified of it." He said, "That's a generous interpretation." She said, "It turned out to be accurate." The silence between them was different now. It had weight and warmth and history in it. He said, "I didn't know you heard that." She said, "I hear most things. I just don't always say them." He said, "I'm aware." She smiled into her coffee. He looked at the smile. He said, "For what it's worth. That night I stood outside your door. I wanted to knock." She looked up. He said, "I talked myself out of it. I told myself it was late and unprofessional and there was no good reason." He paused. "There were several reasons. I just couldn't say them out loud yet." She said, "And now?" He said, "And now I'm saying them out loud." She set down her cup. The morning stretched between them, soft and unhurried. She said, "Weston, the contract has terms about the end. What happens after 2 years, how we separate, the settlement structure." She looked at him. "I've been trying not to think about it. But now I'm thinking about it." He said, "Stop thinking about it." She said, "You can't just." He said, "Camille, stop thinking about it. Because I am going to handle it." She looked at him with those reading eyes. He said, "Trust me." She said, after a moment, "Okay." He nodded. Picked up his cup. She said, "That's the second time you've asked me to trust you." He said, "I know. I'll keep asking until it's not a question anymore." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "You know you are significantly more complicated than your file suggested." He said, "What file?" She said, "The file the attorney sent before our first meeting. 3 pages. I expected someone much more one-dimensional." He said, "I'm choosing not to be offended by that." She grinned. "Good." She picked up her coffee. "Because you are also significantly better than your file suggested." She got up, rinsed her cup, paused at the doorway. "I'm going for a run." He said, "Briggs is on standby." She said, "I know. I already texted him." She left. He sat with his coffee and the morning light and the particular feeling of something being built between 2 people, carefully, honestly, out of materials neither of them had originally planned to use. He was, for the first time in a very long time, not managing anything. He was just present. It was unfamiliar. He decided it was the best thing he had felt in years. The danger arrived without warning, as it always does. Weston had enemies. This was not a surprise. When you controlled the kind of money and influence that coal industries represented, you accumulated opposition the same way a ship accumulates barnacles. It was simply the nature of moving through certain waters for long enough. What he had not anticipated was that someone would decide the most efficient way to reach him was through her. It started with a car that appeared twice in 1 week on the same block where Camille had her morning run. She mentioned it once, casually, the way she mentioned most things, without alarm, as an observation. Weston heard it, filed it, and quietly doubled the security on the building without telling her why. Then came the flowers. Delivered to the penthouse with no card. Weston's head of security, a quiet man named Briggs, ran the origin and came back with a florist that didn't exist at the address listed on the delivery form. The flowers were removed before Camille saw them. Then came the photograph. It arrived in a sealed envelope addressed to Weston at his office, and inside was a photo of Camille taken 3 days prior on the street outside a coffee shop 2 blocks from their building. She was laughing at her phone. She was completely unaware of being photographed. On the back of the photograph, in neat handwriting, were 5 words. She doesn't know, does she? Weston sat with that photograph in his hands for a long time. Then he called Briggs. Then he called his attorney. Then he sat at his desk and looked at the photograph again, at Camille laughing on a sidewalk on an ordinary afternoon, completely unaware, completely unprotected, and he felt something move through him that was cold and absolute and nothing like business. He did not tell Camille. He told himself it was because there was nothing concrete yet. No identified threat. No confirmed danger. He would not alarm her over a photograph and a car and flowers without a card. He told himself it was logical. He did not entirely believe himself. That evening she came to the kitchen while he was still working at the island, which he had taken to doing some nights because the light was better and his office felt too enclosed when his thoughts were running hot. She came in wearing an oversized sweatshirt and socks and her hair pulled back, and she looked so different from the polished woman at his events that for a moment he just looked at her. She opened the fridge. Looked in it. Closed it. Looked at the stove. "Have you eaten?" she asked. "No." She turned and looked at him with the expression she reserved for his worst habits, a mixture of exasperation and something that was trying very hard not to be fond. "Weston, I've been working." She was already pulling out a pan. "You don't have to cook," he said. "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's generally the point of doing something." He watched her move around his kitchen with the confidence she had earned over 3 months of living in it. She had a theory about every pan, an opinion about every spice, and she cooked the way she did everything, with focus and a certain satisfaction in the process. He said, before he had decided to say it, "I need you to be more careful when you go out." She paused, then kept moving. "Why?" He chose his words. "There have been some incidents adjacent to business. Nothing confirmed. But I want Briggs to accompany you when you leave the building." She turned around and looked at him fully now. "That's not nothing. Incidents. It's precautionary." She studied his face with that particular attention she brought to things. He could feel her reading him. She was very good at that. "Are you in danger?" she asked. He said, "I'm always managing some degree of risk. This is nothing new." She turned back to the stove. The silence stretched. Then she said, "You should have told me sooner." He didn't answer. She plated something quickly, set it in front of him, poured a glass of water, and then sat across from him at the island the way she sometimes did when they ended up in the kitchen at the same time in the evenings. It had become a thing, though neither of them had named it that. She said, "Does Theo know? About the business risk?" He went very still. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the island counter. He said carefully, "Why would Theo know about my business?" She looked up. He said something at lunch. "About your company. About someone who wanted to take a piece of it." Weston set down his fork. "What exactly did he say?" She met his gaze and held it. "He said there were people who had been circling coal industries for years. He said you'd made enemies collecting assets that someone else wanted." He seemed, she paused. She chose the word carefully, concerned. The silence that followed was very different from the usual silence between them. "Theo," Weston said, very quietly, "does not discuss my business." She said nothing. "What else did he say?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "He said you built a wall around yourself so high that the people trying to help you can't get close enough to." She didn't finish. Weston looked at the food she had made him. At the glass of water. at the light she had turned on over the stove, because she had noticed once that he got headaches when he worked under the overhead kitchen light, and she had never mentioned it. She had just stopped turning the overhead on. He said, "Theo doesn't know me the way he thinks he does." She said softly, "I think that's part of what he meant." Weston looked at her. Something in his chest pulled in a direction he had no vocabulary for. He said, "Go to bed, Camille. I'll be fine." She stood up. She paused beside his chair on her way out, not touching him, just close enough that he could feel the warmth of proximity. Then she said, "You're allowed to not be fine sometimes." She left. He sat at the island for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called Briggs and said, "I need someone on Theo Mercer. I want to know everything that man has said and done in the past 2 months." He was not sure anymore if it was about the business. He was becoming less sure about a lot of things. The next morning, he did something he had not done in years. He knocked on her door before 8. She opened it with her coffee in her hand, hair still loose, reading glasses pushed up on her head, and that expression she had when she was already in the middle of something and being pulled out of it. He said, "I want to take you somewhere. Not for the company. Not an event. I just want to show you something." She looked at him. He looked back. The morning light was doing something in the hallway that he did not particularly want to think about. She said, "Let me get my shoes." He took her to a small harbor about 40 minutes outside the city, a place he had not been since he was a teenager, before everything got complicated. Before his grandfather got sick and left him a company and a responsibility that had been shaping the rest of his life ever since. There was a dock and a coffee cart and boats moving in the early morning gray, and it was nothing spectacular, but it was real. She stood at the edge of the dock with her coffee and looked at the water and said nothing for a while. He stood beside her. Eventually she said, "You grew up here?" "I came here when I needed to think," he said. She nodded slowly. "What did you need to think about?" He was quiet. Then he said, "How to be 2 things at once. The person I actually was and the person the company needed." She looked at him. He said, "I'm still working on it." She turned back to the water. After a moment she said, "For what it's worth, from where I'm standing, they don't look as different as you think they do." He looked at her profile. She was watching a boat coming in from the gray water, her hands wrapped around her cup, her face open in the way it only was when she thought no one was watching. He said, "Camille." She turned. He had not planned anything after her name. There was nothing rehearsed. There was just her looking at him in the morning light on a dock he had brought her to without a reason that held up under examination, and everything he had been very carefully not thinking for 3 months sitting at the top of his chest waiting. He said, "I don't think this is just a contract anymore." She looked at him for a long time without speaking. Long enough that he felt the full weight of what he had just said. Then she said, very quietly, "I know." Neither of them said anything else. They stood at the edge of the dock in the gray morning air, and she did not move away from him, and he did not put the distance back that he had been maintaining, and after a moment his hand found hers, and he held it and she let him. It was not dramatic. It did not need to be. Something had shifted. And the tide came in and the boats moved and the city waited for them 40 minutes away, and for right now, none of it mattered. All right, if you did not just feel that in your whole entire chest, I am not doing my job. Like this video right now and tell me in the comments what you think Weston should do next, because what is coming in this next part is going to shatter your whole heart and then put it back together wrong. The photograph was not the last one. Briggs called 2 days later with information that rearranged everything. Weston was in his office when the call came. He listened without interrupting for 4 minutes straight, which was not something he typically managed. When Briggs finished, Weston said, "Say it again from the beginning." Slowly, Briggs said it again. The short version was this. The person who had been watching Camille was not a random business rival. He was connected to a man named Lawrence Vance, a property developer who had spent the last 4 years attempting to acquire a specific parcel of land that Coal Industries controlled as part of a broader urban development project in Lower Manhattan. Weston had blocked the acquisition twice. Vance had gone quiet after the second attempt, which Weston had interpreted as retreat. It had not been retreat. Vance's plan, from what Briggs had pieced together from surveillance and source documents, was to use Camille as leverage. Nothing violent. Something worse, in its own way. Evidence that had been fabricated. A constructed narrative about Camille's past, designed to be released to the press in a way that would implicate her in financial misconduct connected to coal industries. It would discredit her, expose the marriage arrangement, embarrass Weston publicly, and destabilize the board at a critical moment before a major acquisition vote. She was not in physical danger. She was in every other kind. And she still didn't know. Weston sat in his office for 6 minutes after the call ended, which was the longest he had been still without purpose in years. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney and his PR director simultaneously, and the next 2 hours were the most efficient crisis management exercise he had run in a decade, and all of it was for her. And he was not pretending anymore that it was anything else. He also called Theo. The call lasted 11 minutes. Most of it was silence with words inserted between the silence. Theo confirmed what he had suspected. He had heard Vance's name in connection with coal industries 6 weeks ago, which was why he had shown up at the gala, which was why he had asked Camille to lunch, which was why he had said what he said about Weston's enemies. Theo had been trying to warn him. In the most indirect, infuriating, Theo-shaped way possible, but still. Weston said, "Next time, call me directly." Theo said, "I did call you directly 3 years ago and you hung up." Weston had nothing for that. He said, "The call from 3 years ago." Theo said, "About Dad's estate. About what he left and what he didn't. You heard my name on the caller ID and declined it." Weston was quiet. Theo said, "I'm not bringing it up to make you feel bad. I'm bringing it up because I need you to understand that I've been on your side for longer than you've been willing to look." The silence that followed was one of the longer ones. Weston said, "I know." Theo said, "That's the first time you've said that." Weston said, "I know that too." Another pause. Theo said, "She's real, Weston. Whatever you two started with, whatever was on paper, that's not what it is now. Don't waste it doing what you always do." Weston said, "What do I always do?" Theo said, "You protect the structure instead of the person inside it." Weston sat with that for a moment. He said, "I'm working on it." Theo said, "Good. Work faster." He went home at 7. Camille was on the couch with her laptop and a blanket, coordinating an event she was still running for an outside client. She looked up when he came in. Something in his face made her close the laptop. He sat down. Not across from her. Beside her. He told her everything. Not a managed version. Not the version filtered through what she needed to know for operational purposes. Everything. Vance, the photographs, the fabricated evidence, what they had been planning, what he had done in the last 2 hours to dismantle it. She listened without interrupting. Her hands were in her lap, and she was very still. When he finished, she said, "How long have you known about the photographs?" He said, 10 days. She looked at him. He said, "I should have told you immediately. I didn't. I told myself it was because there was nothing confirmed yet." That was not entirely true. She said, "What was the other part?" He said, "I didn't want you to be afraid. And I didn't want you to leave." The room was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time. He could not tell what she was thinking, which was unusual. She was usually readable to him even when she was trying not to be. Then she said, "Weston, I signed a contract. I didn't sign away my right to know when I'm in danger." "I know," he said. She said, "And I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. She said, "I haven't been going anywhere for a while now." He exhaled. Long and slow, like something he had been holding was finally allowed to leave. He said, "I know that too." She looked at him. He looked at her. The lamp was on, low and warm, and outside the city did its relentless New York thing, and in here it was just the two of them and the truth, which had been sitting in the room with them for weeks waiting to be acknowledged. He said, "I don't know how to do this. I want to be honest about that. I have been very good for a very long time at not needing things. At keeping everything in the correct place. At running a system that works because nothing unexpected gets inside it." She said, "I know." He said, "You got inside it." She said, very quietly, "I know that too." He reached over and took her hand. Not the practice gesture from the events, not the professional touch for an audience. Just his hand holding hers in a quiet room because he wanted to. She looked at their hands. Then at him. He said, I'm not good at this. She said, you're doing fine. He almost laughed. Almost. The night wound down slowly, both of them staying on that couch longer than made sense, talking about things that had nothing to do with the contract or the company or Vance or Theo. Things like her brother's college major and his grandfather's habit of hiding notes in the margins of company reports, and whether the coffee she'd been making was actually better than his previous method or if he had simply gotten used to it. He already knew the answer. When she finally stood to go to bed, she paused and looked back at him. She said, Weston. The thing you said on the dock. He looked up. She said, I meant what I said too. Just so you know. She went down the hall. He sat in the quiet living room and felt something in his chest settle into a new shape. He didn't fight it this time. The press got the story anyway. Not the fabricated version. Vance had moved faster than Weston's people anticipated, and a version of it, distorted and incomplete but damaging, ran in a financial gossip column on a Tuesday morning. It framed Camille as a planted operative, implied the marriage was a corporate cover, suggested she had prior connections to entities attempting to destabilize coal industries. None of it accurate. All of it designed to create doubt. Weston saw it at 6 in the morning and had his PR team in a call by 6:15. Camille saw it at 6:45, standing in the kitchen with her coffee, reading from her phone with that very particular stillness she had when something had hit hard, but she had decided not to show it yet. She looked up when he came in. He said, I know. We're handling it. She said, how bad is it? Honest answer, he said, it will be a news cycle. We will put out a clear response. The attorney is filing against the source, and by the end of the week it will be countered. But it will exist. It will be searchable. People who want to believe it will believe it for a while. She looked back at her phone. Her jaw was set. He said, Camille. She looked up. He said, this is not your fault. None of it. And I will not let it stand. She said, I know you'll handle it. She paused. She stopped. He moved closer. What? She said, this is what happens when you're near something like your life. Things come for you and anyone standing close gets caught in it. He said, you are not anyone standing close. You are. He stopped. Started again. He said, you are the reason I am handling this at all rather than just managing the business damage. Because the business damage I have managed before. What I haven't managed is someone being used to get to me who matters. She looked at him. He said, you matter. I should have said that before I put you in a position where saying it became necessary. I'm sorry. She put her coffee down. Looked at him for a long moment with something in her eyes that was complicated and real and entirely unperformed. Then she crossed the small distance between them and put her arms around him. He stood very still for exactly 1 second. Then he held her back, and it was careful at first, and then it wasn't, and she held on and he held on, and outside the city was already running at full speed, and none of it existed right now. She said into his shoulder, you matter too. Just so we're being honest. He exhaled against her hair. He said, we're going to be fine. She said, I know. He held on a moment longer than necessary. She did too. That afternoon, his phone lit up with a message from a number he recognized as one of Vance's associates. He forwarded it to Briggs and his attorney without responding. Then he went back to the living room where Camille was working on her laptop, sat down beside her and said nothing. She glanced at him. Read something in his face. She said, what was it? He said, Vance trying to rattle me. She said, did it work? He said, no. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to her laptop. But she moved just slightly closer. Close enough that their arms were touching. He did not point this out. He did not move away. He opened his own laptop and worked for an hour beside her in quiet, and it was the most settled he had felt all day. Later that evening, his mother called. Weston's mother, Elaine Cole, was a woman of 70 who had survived his father's death, 3 hostile board attempts, and the sustained attentions of a financial press that had always found the Cole family interesting. She was not easily alarmed. She was, however, calling at 9 in the evening, which was her version of alarmed. He took the call in his office. She said, I saw the story. He said, I know. It's being handled. She said, I know you're handling it. That's not why I called. He waited. She said, I called because I want to know how Camille is. He paused. His mother said, Weston, I have been watching you for 34 years. I know when something has changed. She paused. She also called me, by the way, 2 weeks ago. She wanted to ask if there was anything she should know about the family. History, people, old tensions. She said she wanted to be prepared in case anything came up. She didn't tell you she called me. He said no. His mother said she was protecting you. She said she didn't want to worry you with questions. She just wanted to be ready. That is not the behavior of a woman who is simply honoring a contract. He said nothing. His mother said, she's good, Weston. He said, I know. His mother said, do not be an idiot. He said, everyone keeps saying that to me. His mother said, then perhaps take the note. After the call, he went back to the living room. Camille had turned the overhead light off and the lamp on, the one she knew he preferred. She was still on her laptop. He sat beside her. She said, without looking up, how's your mom? He looked at her. She looked up, maintained composure, failed slightly at the corners of her mouth. He said, you called her. She said, I call her every 2 weeks. She likes to know what's happening at galas. He said, Camille. She said, she's very easy to talk to. She knows everyone at every event you attend, and she gives excellent background. He said, you called her to get information so you could protect me and you didn't tell me. She met his eyes. She said, I didn't want you to feel monitored. He said, I feel the opposite of monitored. She tilted her head slightly. He said, I feel taken care of. Which is not something I have a lot of practice with. She looked at him with those careful, seeing eyes. He said, thank you. She said, it's what partners do. The word landed between them. Partners. Not contracted parties. Not professional associates. Not two people in an arrangement with clearly defined terms. Partners. He said yes. She went back to her laptop. He went back to his. Their shoulders were still touching. Nobody mentioned it. But the week did not end cleanly. On Wednesday evening, Camille did not come home. Weston noticed at 7. Her last known location from Briggs's tracker was a dry cleaner 6 blocks from the penthouse, where she had gone to pick up 2 of his suits. The tracker had gone still at 4:45 in the afternoon. By 7:15, Weston was in Briggs's operations center in the building's lower level, looking at a map and keeping his voice very controlled. By 7:30, they had the dry cleaner's security footage. Camille had collected the suits. She had walked out. A black sedan had been idling at the curb. 2 men had approached her quickly. She had not gone willingly. Weston watched the footage once. Then he turned to Briggs and said, find her. I don't care what it costs or who you have to call. Find her tonight. Then he called Theo. Theo picked up on the first ring, which told Weston he had already heard something. Theo said, I know. I just got word from a contact at Vance's firm. He's moving up his timeline. He's using her as a pressure play to force you to withdraw from the acquisition vote. Weston said, where is she? Theo said, my contact thinks Vance has a property in the Bronx. Old warehouse near the port. He paused. Weston. I'm coming with you. Weston said, you don't have to. Theo said, she matters to you, which means she matters. I'm coming. 22 minutes later, they were in a car heading north through the city, Briggs confirming the warehouse address, 3 additional security contractors in a second vehicle behind them. Weston sat in the back of the car and did something he almost never did, which was let himself feel the thing he was feeling without trying to manage it. He was afraid. Not the professional calibrated risk assessment kind of afraid. The other kind. The kind that lived in the chest and refused to be filed. He thought about her on the dock. He thought about her coffee on his desk every morning. He thought about her counting his 4 seconds outside her door. He thought, I have spent my entire adult life building walls, and she walked through every single one of them without trying, and I sat there and let her, and that was the smartest thing I ever did, and she cannot be in a warehouse in the Bronx because of me. He said, very quietly, to nobody, faster. The driver went faster. The warehouse was dark from the outside. Briggs's team moved through the building in 12 minutes. Weston did not wait in the car. He went in with them and Theo went in beside him and nobody argued about it. They found her on the second floor, seated, wrists bound, unhurt. A man standing guard who was disarmed before he finished turning around. She looked up when Weston came through the door, and the expression on her face when she saw him was something he was going to carry for the rest of his life. She said, "You took 22 minutes. He crossed the room and cut the binding from her wrists himself. His hands were steady. He did not know how. He said, "Are you hurt?" She said, "I'm fine." They were rough but not violent. They were waiting for Vance to call back. He said he's not going to be making calls for a very long time. She looked at him, at his face, at whatever was written there that he hadn't managed to put back behind the wall yet. She said, "Weston." He said, "I know." She said, "Your face is doing something." He said, "I'm aware." She said, "It's okay." He exhaled. He took her hands, her freed, red-wrist hands, and held them carefully. He said, "I was afraid." She said, "I know." He said, "I am not accustomed to being afraid." She said, "I know that too." He pulled her to her feet and held her, and this time there was nothing careful about it. He held her like someone holding something they almost lost, which was what he was, and she held him back with her arms around his neck and her face against his jaw, and the warehouse was cold and smelled like rust, and he did not care about any of it. Theo appeared in the doorway, looked at the two of them, and said, "I'll wait downstairs." Neither of them responded. He was good enough to take that as an answer. In the car on the way home, she sat against his side with his arm around her, and he did not speak for most of the ride, and she did not require him to. The city moved past the windows, all its relentless ordinary light, completely unaware that anything had happened or changed or been almost taken. She said, at some point, he was never going to get what he wanted. Weston said no. He wasn't. She said, so this was always going to end with him failing. Weston said yes. She said, then I was never actually in that much danger. He looked at her. She said, logically. He said, Camille. She said yes. He said, you were in a warehouse with your hands tied. She said, I'm aware. He said, do not rationalize what just happened into something small. She was quiet for a moment. He said, I don't want you to do that thing where you minimize it to protect me from feeling it. I felt it. It's already in me. You don't have to manage my reaction. She looked up at him. He said, I was afraid. I'm allowed to have been afraid. You're allowed to have been afraid too. She said, after a moment, I was. He said, okay. She said, I kept thinking. About this morning. About you in the kitchen. About all the mornings. He looked at her. She said, I kept thinking, I have too many mornings left with him to let this be the end. His arm tightened around her. She said, so I stayed calm. I didn't fight. I just waited. Because I knew you would come. He said, I will always come. She looked at him with those eyes. He said, that is not a contractual statement. She said, I know. He said, that is a permanent statement. She said, I know that too. The rest of the ride home was quiet in the way that only happens when everything necessary has already been said. If that scene just made your heart stop for a second, same. Share this story right now with someone who deserves a good cry today. And subscribe because we are so close to the ending and you do not want to miss a single word of what comes next. The next morning, everything felt different in the penthouse. Not dramatically different. Not the kind of different that announces itself loudly and demands acknowledgement. The quiet kind. The kind where the light seems to fall in slightly new angles, and the familiar rooms feel like they're settling into a shape they were always meant to have. Camille was up before him, which was also not unusual, but she was standing at the window when he came down, looking at the city with her coffee in both hands. And the morning light was hitting her in a way that stopped him at the bottom of the stairs for a moment before he moved again. She heard him anyway. She said, without turning, I've been thinking. He came to stand beside her at the window. She said, when I signed the contract. She paused. I told myself it was purely practical. That I was going in clear-eyed. That I understood exactly what I was agreeing to and exactly what I wasn't. He looked at her profile. She said, I was clear-eyed. But I wasn't entirely right about what I was agreeing to. He said, "What do you mean?" She turned to look at him. She said, "I thought I was agreeing to perform something. To act a part." She looked back at the window. "I didn't realize I was agreeing to actually be known by someone." She paused. "You know me, Weston. You've been paying attention from the beginning even when you were pretending not to. And somewhere in the middle of being known, I stopped being able to pretend the rest of it was performance." He said nothing for a moment. The city moved below them, indifferent and constant. He said, "I paid attention because it was you." He paused. "I tried to stop. I was thorough about trying." She said, "I know. I watched you try." He said, "Was it obvious?" She said, "Only to me." She looked at him. "Because I was paying attention back." He looked at her. She said, "You fold your reading glasses into your left breast pocket even when you're not wearing a jacket. You say the word specifically when you're about to say something you've been thinking about for a while, but don't want to seem like you've been thinking about it. You go very still when something surprises you, not a flinch, just still, like the rest of your body is waiting for your brain to catch up." He said, "You've been cataloging me." She said, "You started it." He almost laughed. She said, "And you rearrange things on your desk when you're unsettled. Not randomly. You put the important things closer to you." He looked at her. She said, "You moved my event folder to the top of your desk 3 weeks ago. The one I gave you with the quarterly gala schedule." He said, "That was for practical reference." She said, "Weston." He said, "Okay. Fine." She grinned. He said, "For the record, you hum the same 4 bars of something I haven't been able to identify every morning when you think the kitchen is empty." She blinked. He said, "And you eat the same breakfast every day, but you buy different fruit every week like you're hoping the variety will eventually convince you to change your routine." She said, "That is extremely observant." He said, "You started it." She laughed. "That real one. The one he had been watching from across ballrooms and finally got to keep for himself." He reached out and tucked a loose strand back from her face, very gently, and she went very still the way he did when something surprised him, and then she leaned into it just slightly, just enough. He said, "The contract needs to be rewritten." She said, "Now you're bringing up the contract." He said, "The new terms are going to include honesty as a standing requirement." She said, "Agreed." He said, "And the proximity clause needs to be eliminated entirely." She said, "Also agreed." He said, "And I'd like to add a permanence clause." She looked at him. He said, "Non-negotiable." She said, "You're negotiating while saying it's non-negotiable." He said, "That's correct." She looked at him for a long moment, that full reading attention, nothing held back. She said, "I accept the terms." He exhaled. She said, "Subject to one addition." He said, "Name it." She said, "You have to knock on my door when you're standing outside it." He was quiet. She said, "No more 4 seconds and walking away." He said, "I'll add it to the contract." She said, "Good." He reached out and took her hand, the same way he had on the dock, not for anyone watching, not for any audience at all, just because it was true. She wove her fingers through his, and they stood at the window while the city ran its ordinary course below, and above them the sky was doing something extraordinary with the light. Neither of them mentioned that the coffee was getting cold. Neither of them moved. The week that followed settled into something new. Not the careful choreography of 2 people maintaining professional distance in shared spaces. Something looser. More honest. More alive. He started knocking on her door. Every time. She started opening it before the second knock, which he chose not to comment on because she would only say she had good hearing, and they would both know that was not entirely what it was. She called his mother again, but this time she told him first, and this time he asked her to send his regards, and his mother apparently told Camille that getting regards from Weston was the interpersonal equivalent of him writing a sonnet, which Camille found very funny and reported in full when she got off the phone. Theo came for dinner on a Sunday. Weston cooked, which was an experiment that produced something edible through significant effort, and which Theo and Camille were both extremely diplomatic about. And after dinner the 3 of them sat in the living room with the kind of ease that takes years to build between people, except somehow they had built it in a season. Theo said, "At one point, I want you both to know that the gala was not a setup." I genuinely did not know who she was when I introduced myself. He paused. I saw someone who looked like she was lighting up a room from the inside and I thought, that's interesting. Camille said, and then you found out she was your brother's wife. Theo said, and then I found out and I thought, of course he found someone like that and is standing 20 feet away pretending he doesn't notice. Weston said, I noticed. Theo said, brother, the entire room noticed that you noticed. You were gripping a whiskey glass like it personally offended you. Camille turned to look at Weston. Weston said nothing. Camille said, you were jealous. Weston said, I was concerned about Theo's intentions. Theo said, that is genuinely the most diplomatic reframe I have ever heard. Camille said, Weston. Weston said, fine. Yes. I was jealous. Are we done? Camille grinned the full grin. Theo grinned. Weston looked at the ceiling. He said, this is what family is like, isn't it? People just say the true thing at you. Theo said, welcome to it. Weston looked at Camille. She was still grinning. He said, you're enjoying this. She said, I'm enjoying this immensely. He said, noted. But he did not move away from her on the couch. And when Theo left an hour later and the apartment was quiet again, he sat beside her in the lamplit living room and felt the particular warmth of a space that had become home without him scheduling it or planning it or approving it in advance. He said, I didn't have this before. She said, what? He said, this. People. Dinner. Someone who talks to my mother. He paused. Someone who counts to 4 outside my door. She said, you had the company. He said, yes. He paused. It's not the same. She said, no. It's not. He looked at her. She said, for what it's worth. I didn't have it either. I had my brother. My mother's medical appointments. Budgets that didn't balance. She paused. I had competence. I was very competent. But competence is lonely at 3 in the morning. He said, it is. She said, this is better. He said, yes. She put her head on his shoulder. He let her. He put his head against hers. The lamp was warm. Outside the city was doing what it always did. He said, very quietly, I want to do this for the rest of my life. She said, the sitting quietly after dinner part or the you part. He said, the you part. She said, that's the best contract revision you've come up with yet. He said, I'll have it on paper by morning. She said, you will not have a marriage proposal on paper by morning. He said, watch me. She laughed. He held her close. She let him. And outside, somewhere across the city that had witnessed all of it from the beginning, the night ran on without them, and they stayed exactly where they were, which was exactly where they wanted to be. If you're crying right now, first of all, same, and second of all, you need to share this story with someone who needs it today. And subscribe if you are not already subscribed, because the ending of this story is going to live in your chest for a week. The board vote happened on a Friday. Weston stood in the boardroom at the head of a table that had defined the shape of his adult life, and he presented the acquisition case with the same precision and authority he always brought to these rooms. The numbers were clear. The strategy was sound. The projections held under scrutiny. The vote went 14-2 in favor. Coal Industries would move forward. Afterward, Gerald Whitmore stopped him in the corridor and said, "You've grown this year, Weston. Your grandfather would be pleased." Weston said, "Thank you, Gerald." Whitmore said, "The girl is the reason. Don't be an idiot about it." Weston said, "I'm working on not being an idiot." Whitmore patted his arm and walked away. Weston took out his phone. He texted Camille. The vote passed. She replied in under 30 seconds. "I know. Briggs texted me. Come home." He looked at the message. He looked at the word home. He put his phone in his pocket and walked to the elevator, and for the first time in years did not think about what was on his desk waiting. He only thought about the kitchen and the lamp and her on the couch and the particular warmth of a place that had become his because of her. The Vance situation resolved itself with the particular completeness that came from having the right attorneys and the right evidence and the willingness to pursue it all the way. By the following month, Vance had withdrawn from any activity connected to coal industries, and the fabricated article had been formally retracted by the publication that ran it with an apology that Weston's attorney had spent considerable time ensuring was specific enough to be meaningful. Life shifted into something that looked almost like normal, except that normal had been entirely redefined. Camille stopped keeping her things so carefully contained to her side of the penthouse. Her books appeared on the shelves in the living room. Her coffee setup migrated from the cabinet above the kettle to the counter beside it. A throw blanket she particularly liked ended up permanently on the couch in the spot she usually occupied. None of this was discussed. It simply accumulated, like proof. Weston moved his morning office time 30 minutes later, so he could be in the kitchen when she made the coffee. He did not tell her this was why. She knew. Because she always knew. One Saturday morning, she was at the kitchen island reading something on her phone, and he came in and sat across from her with his coffee and looked at her in the soft morning light and thought about how his grandfather had said once that a man knows when something is right the same way he knows when a number doesn't balance, not through logic but through the plain inability to find an error. He couldn't find an error anywhere in this. He said, "Camille." She looked up. He said, "I love you." She looked at him. He said, "I want to be clear that this is not a contract clause. It is not a strategic statement. It is not tied to any arrangement or timeline. It is just the truth, and I've been holding it for a while, and I think it deserves to exist out loud." She put her phone down. She said, "How long?" He said, "Honestly? The board meeting. When you told Gerald about the coffee." She was quiet. Then she said, "That was 3 months ago." He said, "I know. I told you I wasn't good at this." She said, "Weston." He said, "I know." She said, "I love you too." He looked at her. She said, "I've been holding it for approximately the same amount of time, and I also was not saying anything because your face does this thing where you look like you've been asked to perform surgery when feelings are in the room, and I didn't want to be the one who made you have that face." He said, "What face am I making right now?" She looked at him. She said, "Not that face." He came around the island and pulled her off the stool and held her, and she held him back with her whole self, and it was nothing like the polished couple they had presented at galas. It was just two people in a kitchen on a Saturday morning with their coffee getting cold, which was better than anything the contract had ever described. He said into her hair, "The attorney is going to need a new brief." She laughed. She said, "You're really not going to just say, 'Let's get married,' like a normal person." He said, "I could say it like a normal person." She said, "Go ahead." He pulled back and looked at her. He said, "Camille Monroe, will you marry me? Actually. Not on paper. Not for the board. Not for the company. For me." She looked at him with those eyes that saw everything and had always seen everything and had been patient enough to wait for him to catch up. She said, "I already said yes 3 months ago on a doc. You're just slow." He laughed. A real one. Full and unguarded and entirely his. She grinned. He said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "That is absolutely a yes." He pulled her back in and held her, and she let him, and outside the city ran its Saturday course, and in here everything was warm and certain and theirs. The wedding was small. Not because Weston couldn't have filled a ballroom, but because she didn't want that, and he had learned, finally, to ask what she wanted before assuming. 20 people. A rooftop at sunset. Gerald Whitmore in the front row looking deeply satisfied, which was the Gerald Whitmore equivalent of weeping openly. Theo standing beside Weston as best man, a role they had arrived at through 2 long conversations and 1 dinner where Weston had simply said, "I need you there," and Theo had said, "Obviously," and that was that. Weston's mother Elaine sat in the second row in something green that Camille had quietly helped her choose, which Weston discovered the morning of and chose to find endearing rather than conspiratorial. Camille's brother Marcus flew in from college and spent most of the ceremony failing to hold it together at the edges in a way that was fully visible and that Camille found deeply charming. Camille wore something simple and extraordinary. She had chosen it herself. No stylist, no consultation, just her and her own instincts, which had always been excellent. She walked toward him across a rooftop in the golden sideways light of a New York evening, carrying nothing but herself, and she was looking at him in that full direct way she had, the way that had been reading him since a conference room 9 months ago. And he stood at the front of that rooftop and thought about all of it. The 47 pages. The steady hands on the pen. The doc and the coffee and the gala and 4 seconds outside a door that he would spend the rest of his life being grateful he had eventually knocked on. He thought, I almost missed this. He thought, I am the luckiest kind of fool. She reached him. He said, very quietly, just for her, before the officiant spoke a single word, you know you're the exception to every rule I ever made. She said, I know. He said, it's inconvenient. She said, extremely. The officiant cleared his throat. They both laughed. Real, surprised laughter, the kind that gets loose in moments that matter too much to be entirely solemn. They said their vows. His were direct and specific and entirely without performance, just truth delivered cleanly the way he always delivered things that mattered. Hers were warm and even, and she ended them by saying, I choose you. Not the arrangement. Not the terms. You. The actual you, which is better than anything the contract described. He said, I choose you too. He paused. I chose you a long time before I admitted it. Gerald Whitmore made a sound from the front row that was impossible to categorize, but clearly positive. They chose each other, fully, in front of 20 people and the whole wide city below them, and it was real, and it was theirs, and it was nothing that had ever been in any contract. Theo shook Weston's hand after, and then pulled him into a brief embrace, and Weston did not stiffen, and Theo noticed, and it said everything that needed saying. Elaine held Camille's face in both hands and said, welcome, properly. Camille said, thank you for the calls. Elaine said, thank you for making him knock on the door. Weston said, I can hear you both. Neither of them stopped. Marcus shook Weston's hand with the serious assessment of a younger brother who has been running his own quiet threat evaluation and arrived at cautious approval. He said, she counts to 4 sometimes. I never understood it before now. Weston said, I know what it means. Marcus looked at him for a moment, nodded once, and went to find food. Later that night, after everyone had gone, they were the last 2 people on the rooftop. The city blazed below them. She was leaning against the railing, and he stood beside her, and it was quiet in the way New York sometimes gets quiet when it forgets a moment for a second and leaves the people in it alone. She said, I want to keep my event work. My own clients. He said, obviously. She said, and the kitchen reorganization I have in mind is the final one. He said, I'll believe that when I see it. She said, and I want to meet your grandfather's grave sometime. If that's okay. He looked at her. She said, you talk about him like he was the person who understood you best. I'd like to say something to him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, yes. I'd like that too. She nodded. She looked at the city. He said, Camille. She turned. He said, I love you. She said, I know. She stepped closer. I love you too. She put her hand flat against his chest. For a long time, actually. He said, I know that too. She said, say it again. He said, I know. She grinned. He pulled her close and she came willingly and the city blazed, indifferent and magnificent, and they held on, and it was enough. And it was everything. 7 months later, on a Tuesday morning in that kitchen that had witnessed every important thing that had happened between them, Camille set a small object on the island in front of Weston and said nothing. He looked down. He looked up at her. She was watching him with her hands wrapped around her coffee and her eyes doing the thing they did when she was feeling something enormous and trying to hold it steady. He said, is this? She said yes. He looked at the small white test with its unmistakable result. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that was bigger than words, bigger than contracts, bigger than the 44 floors of coal industries, bigger than everything he had spent his whole adult life building, because he had thought that was what mattered. He came around the island. He held her face in his hands. He said, Camille. She said, I know. He said, we're. She said, we are. He kissed her forehead and held her, and she held him, and outside the city ran its brilliant, relentless course, and inside this kitchen, in this life that had started with a contract and 47 pages of terms, something entirely uncontractable and entirely permanent was beginning. And that is where we leave them. Not at the end of something. At the beginning of everything. Two people who found each other through a document and stayed for something no document could ever contain. Weston Cole, the man who built walls before he checked who was already inside, standing in a kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning, holding the woman who had walked into a conference room with steady hands and changed everything. And Camille Monroe, who had signed a business arrangement and gotten a whole life. If this story found you today, if some part of it felt like something you needed, please share it with someone who would feel it too. Like this video, drop a comment telling me your favorite moment, and subscribe to come back for the next story, because we are just getting started and every single one of them is going to wreck you in the best possible way.